I know we all have been waiting for this great day to come. That day has come. Let us welcome our honorable guest and speaker, Mr. Sarafian, the Director of Gamidas Institute, London.
Thank you very much for that welcome and warmth. I'm not used to this kind of treatment, so I think I'll come back again if you ask me. I'd like to thank this Seyfo Center and the Syrian Americans of Southern California for making this meeting possible. And one of the key themes that always comes up with Assyrians is always why is it that Armenian authors or Armenian lobbyists, Armenian historians don't recognize the Assyrian genocide? I mean, you see these books, and why isn't it a prominent issue? Why Armenians? I mean, you don't want Armenians to recognize the Assyrian genocide, you want the world to recognize it. It's a bigger issue. And while we say Armenians and Assyrians lived alongside each other, the truth is that most Assyrians and most Armenians did not live alongside each other. This is a major difference. 90 to 95% of Armenians did not live alongside Assyrians, and where Armenians live, few Assyrians live, but they were interspaced, places like Harput and Malatya. The whole question of deportation keeps coming up, that Armenians were supposedly to be deported in 1915, and it's during these deportations that they were murdered. So the deportation idea is a very visual. In the Assyrian case, there was no pretense of deportation. The Assyrians were murdered, the word slaughtered was used before, and you called the Seyfo quite rightly. The Assyrians, for the most part, were murdered in their villages, in their towns. They were not taken their zor. There was no sort of long drawn-out process. It was much bloodier, much more primitive, and much more brutal in some ways than the Armenians. If a Turk offered my grandmother's land back to me, I would say, I appreciate sentiment and I'd like you to keep it, right? I think that would be a nice gesture too. We don't mean you harm in resolving these problems. We can resolve these issues without harming people. And that might, in some ways, I think is the right balance and right attitude. It's not about revenge. I personally would not accept blood money. I think you're letting them off free. If they said, how much is your grandfather worth to you? $50,000? Would you accept that? They believe the government, but if you talk to them on one-to-one basis, you can win them over. And the idea is to win them over. You know, it's entirely up to us. And that's where the solution lies. And the youngsters, you can win them over.
مجد قاموا أنا قلت لها ليلة تيلا ليتوتا قد بشاقل بشوبا جو شوك من لوس أنجلس كتلام مدينة خينة أنا قايلت داها هلقت إحنا نأتوراي بشنت شنرا بشلي بيبخ بود أجسياتن بود قتلان بود كفتشياتن بموت أرخشاتن أنا برسوبايت رابط تخمني قد شركة خوالجانا من أرمناي سبعاني زي أما أمديان بيشنا قطيلة بيشنا ظلمية رابا بش رابا من ديان إن أرمناي غزيلي كد أمريكا وودر من أمريكا برلمان أرمينيا ليلة جينوسايد أطراي قابوله غزيلي خاور خشابرتها قاموا أنا ميقرأ سرافيان قد شنو متالي يلبانو نسيانو بلخانو يكل الدنيا كل أرمناي كطيلة هاد بغزايت انك ما كتاب زي بسمنا له تخمني قد ما ينلخا قد ان أطراي قد مارنا قاموخا أرمناي مو يتلخا أرمناي مو ينلخا قد أم قديان تاني قد سيراي زي بيشنا قطيلة برقوا لدن أرمناي قد إجنور بعدنا لنا بخشابة لنا بداية قد إحنا أنا برسوبايت على ده مسألة رابع قشة بلخلي وأو بسيم أم يقرأ سرافيان بهايرت ترباشو تابيات بوشران سبانسر أويلان قد ما يخلي أمريكا أم يقرأ عم يقرأ أنا باسو بخشابن جو تلفزيون وجو فلاير كد اتن قاد باسو مزمن أنا لمسن بشابة تانن بلكي جانو تاني دو يدانت بقريات كم ستن بقاروخ منو بقريتون.
Professor Ara Sarafian, on behalf of LA County Supervisor Michael Antonovich and the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors, I would like to welcome you here in Los Angeles and to this venue today. بنومتي مغبة أبيتم باسيم قتيتو خنوديو مياقور وقت مياقرا أرا سرافيان وبشمخ اتليهيوي بوزودة بارنخ بتشئيت جانن بوديو يوما أبيتم باسيم.
Thank you very much for that welcome and warmth. I'm not used to this kind of treatment, so it's I think I'll come back again if you ask me. I'd like to thank this Seyfo Center and the Syrian Americans of Southern California for making this meeting possible. When I was invited to come here, of course, I actually wanted to talk to you. I have a lot to learn from Assyrians, and it's an issue that's been with me ever since I've been working as a scholar. And one of the key themes that always comes up with Assyrians is always why is it that Armenian authors or Armenian lobbyists, Armenian historians don't recognize the Assyrian genocide? I mean, you see these books, and why isn't it a prominent issue? And it bothers me, and I've tried to come up with reason, explanations. And clearly, one of them is the question of ignorance. Armenians are like other ordinary people, and they actually don't know. That might be surprising to Assyrians, but that really is a case. Most Armenians know of the genocide through family histories, or maybe they might have read one book like Ambassador Morgenthau's story. This is a level of understanding. And it's important that we also recognize this so that we can talk in terms of, okay, what can we do about it to change things? And the other part of this discussion is, why Armenians? I mean, you don't want Armenians to recognize the Assyrian genocide, you want the world to recognize it. So it's a bigger issue. And the third element is that no, the Assyrian genocide doesn't have to be unknown. It can be known. It's a question of just doing the work for it. And only in recent years you've seen major changes amongst Assyrian Americans, and globally I should say, sorry. And the future is actually positive. It's a question of just getting on with it and doing more of the same in an informed manner without creating problems that aren't there, and making progress. And it's already happening, and I'll come and discuss that later. But why is it, let's start from the position, why is it that the Assyrian genocide is relatively unknown as opposed to the Armenian genocide? I'd like to start with a map, and I'm going to return to this map again. It's a map of Armenians again in the Ottoman Empire. But if we look at the map where Armenians lived and where the Armenian genocide was carried out, you can see that this is Armenia today, but the red circles represent the density of Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire in 1915. And as you can see, this is Armenia proper, this part here. But Armenians lived from Kars eastwards to the capital of Constantinople. And while we say Armenians and Assyrians lived alongside each other, the truth is that most Assyrians and most Armenians did not live alongside each other. This is a major difference in the way the events were played out. That means the theater of the Armenian genocide and the theater of the Assyrian genocide were actually very different physically. The Assyrians were to the south of Armenians, and there was a gray area, areas like Diyarbakir, some in Mardin, but 90 to 95% of Armenians did not live alongside Assyrians, and where Armenians live, few Assyrians live, but they were interspaced, places like Harput and Malatya. So there is a significant difference of where these different populations live. That's one major difference. Secondly, and in my discussion, I'm going to talk about Urmi as well, because that's part of the Seyfo. So separate population distribution within the Ottoman Empire. Secondly, the actual genocidal process that was implemented vis-a-vis Armenians, or the popular notion how the Armenians were killed to the Seyfo. In the Armenian case, the whole question of deportation keeps coming up. That Armenians were supposedly to be deported in 1915, and it's during these deportations that they were murdered. So the deportation idea is a very visual part of the Armenian genocide, where large numbers of women, older men, and children were marched to the Syrian deserts. Many were killed on the way, especially those from the western parts, and then they were killed in Deir Zor. In the Assyrian case, there was no pretense of deportation. The Assyrians were murdered. The word slaughtered was used before, and you called the Seyfo quite rightly. The Assyrians, for the most part, were murdered in their villages, in their towns. They were not taken Deir Zor. There was no sort of long, drawn-out process. It was much bloodier, much more primitive, and much more brutal in some ways than the Armenians. And thirdly, Armenians who lived in sort of Assyrian areas or mixed with Assyrians in places like Mardin, Diyarbakir, Siirt, those Armenians were killed just like the Assyrians. There were no pretense of deportations. The descriptions that we have of Siirt, they took them outside of the town and they butchered them. So the Armenians and Syrians for the most part lived separately. There was some difference in the process of killing, and so these were major differences between the two. Third factor, to do with geography once more. Armenians were in larger numbers. There were about 2.1 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire as opposed to about 500,000 Assyrians of all denominations. But Armenians, where Armenians were killed, there were foreign witnesses. There were American consulates in Harput or Trabzon or even Aleppo. These foreign consulates were an important way of getting information out about the killings. Then there were the missionaries. There were many more missionaries in areas where Armenians lived as opposed to Assyrians in Upper Mesopotamia. And in fact, the reason that we know so much about the Armenian genocide, and this is to do with American politics, is because the United States itself and American missionaries played a very, very prominent role in reporting what they saw to the State Department in 1915. And by October 1915 already, the State Department was releasing reports on what they call the Armenian genocide to the American press. The Americans were witnesses to the Armenian genocide. The Americans publicized what was happening, and the world first learned about the killings that was taking place precisely because the American government itself was leaking these reports through missionaries to the American public so that they can raise funds and to save victims. And now we come back to the Assyrians. Because of this American presence, the Assyrians who lived in the Urmia region were covered by the American State Department. Because there were so many American missionaries in the Urmia region, and because there were American consulates in places like Tabriz. So the reason that we know so much more about the genocide of Assyrians in Urmia in 1915, 1916 is for the same reason that why we know more about the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. Because the main way that information was getting out and was being disseminated in the world at that time was this American connection. And because in Urmia there were Americans, the Assyrian genocide in Urmia is known, but not in Hakkari and not in Upper Mesopotamia, where there were even more Assyrians. So there's also a conspiracy here. It's just that the flow of information was such that the Armenian report was reported in a way that the Assyrian wasn't. And the first American relief efforts in October 1915 were initially called the Committee on Armenian Atrocities when they first released this information. But interestingly, very soon afterwards, they changed the name. It became the American Committee for Armenian and Syrian Relief. They call them Syrians, the Americans. So already the Americans were reporting the Assyrian genocide with a particular focus in Urmia region, but they also knew that things were happening in places like Diyarbakir and Mardin, but they did not have that many details. So the world didn't know at the time, but the emphasis was on Armenians because there were more witnesses there and there were more victims. Part of my work, for example, when I compiled State Department reports on the Armenian genocide, and I published as a book, I found very little information on Assyrians. The State Department did not know much about what was happening to Assyrians, but the American missionaries did. So if you read the Missionary Herald, this journal that was put out by missionaries, and especially by Presbyterian missionaries, there were more Presbyterians working in Urmia region, you find that in their publications, the Assyrian issue is very, very prominent, and some of the most harrowing accounts of the murders that were taking place and wiping out villages were being reported by the Presbyterian missionaries. And today, a lot of that material still hasn't been unearthed and hasn't been utilized, and we hope that that will change soon. Similarly, when the British government itself started compiling a report on the persecution of Christians in the Ottoman Empire, the so-called famous Blue Book report, the main source of information was the United States. If you look at the Blue Book, it's primarily about Armenians and Urmia. And Urmia is about practically all of it is about Assyrians. And it's about 100 pages out of 500 pages of reports. 20% is about Urmia alone. Initially, this book was going to be, there was plans to call this the treatment of Armenians and Assyrians in the Ottoman Empire, but the British publishers decided not to do so. I think it was mainly because they did not have the information available at the time. So these are sort of practical reasons that explain why the world knows less about Assyrians at that time, but also today. The bias was always in favor of Armenians for geographical and numerical reasons. And that has sort of carried even to our day, which is why Assyrians have less visibility. Talking of visibility, but there were also Assyrians living, as mentioned before, places like further north where the Armenians were, but those Assyrians for the most part, or in a large part, were Armenian speaking. Often they had Armenian names, and certainly they were treated as Armenians. So you will not know the fact that that particular victim was actually Assyrian, because they were taken away like Armenians, and they had the same fate as Armenians. And they were reported along those lines even by the missionaries and the Americans. So these are just the practical reasons why the world knows less about the Assyrian genocide. However, but that is not the end of the story, because we're talking about one type of sources. But those sources were very important at the time, and they sort of created the context in which the Assyrian or the Armenian issue are being discussed. Immediately after World War I, in some ways the Assyrians were worse off than Armenians. And second, the Armenians were focused on the new Armenian Republic in the Caucasus. Their focus was on the Armenian genocide as a way of justifying the creation of a larger Armenian state, which would include parts of the former Ottoman Empire. It's like a divorce proceeding, and now they're sort of arguing who takes what. So the focus politically was always on the fate of Armenians. It wasn't scholarly. It wasn't about having the bigger picture. It was about making specific points about the murder of Armenians and Armenian demands for territorial, at that time, concessions from the former Ottoman Empire. Now, often by the 1920s and 30s, these issues died down. In 1965, 50 years after the events, Armenians were once more, especially including Soviet Armenia, they demonstrated on the 50th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. I'm not aware if Assyrians did anything at the time. By the 1970s, you had a fringe group of Armenians, terrorists, who started murdering Turkish diplomats, saying this is a sort of armed struggle for the liberation of Armenia. They were Marxists, they had idealists like the PLO and at that time. The terrorist agitation of these groups once more brought the Armenian issue to the fore. If the Turkish government at that time, and the Assyrians, if the Turkish government at that time had said, yes, you are right, terrible things happened in 1915, we have to look at it and we have to sort it out, maybe history would have taken a different turn. But the Turkish state's response to those events was to go into denialist mode once more. The Turkish silence was broken by saying there was no Armenian genocide, Armenians were terrorists, the Armenian genocide thesis is a fabrication that is being pushed by Armenian terrorists because they want to make demands for Soviet Armenia against Turkey. It's very bizarre arguments. But by the 1970s, the Armenian world was once more enraged by this type of comments from Turkey. And by the 1980s, when I started growing up, this issue became live again, at a time when the Assyrian wasn't. And the new scholarship that was being propounded by professors like Vahakan Daderian, Richard Ovanesyan, Gerard Libarigian, once more we're talking about the Armenian issue, and you read and hear anything about Assyrians. So when I was growing up, I was never exposed to the Assyrian issues. Now, we can start faulting these professors because this is happening 50 years after the event, and these are some Western scholars. But again, Armenians had a voice at the time when Assyrians didn't have a voice. And once more, people talk of 1915 as an Armenian experience. And the same was for Soviet Armenia. Like Richard Giragosyan was a Soviet Armenian scholar. Again, once more, it was about the Armenians. It was bourgeois politics and the Armenian genocide. But Assyrians were always left out. Again, partly because of ignorance and a lack of sources. And also, these guys didn't really bother to find out. Because if you really wanted, you can still find out. But it wasn't easy, and they never went in that direction. So when my generation grew up, the reason that I didn't know when in my 20s, I didn't really know about the Assyrian was because of the nature of a debate. And this is sort of long-worded debate, but it's important for you to understand how we came to this position so that we can say, okay, what can we do about academia, about lobbyist groups? How can we win people over to the Assyrian, to be more wary of the Assyrian issue? And this brings us to very basic points. And by the way, it's not all doom and gloom. The Assyrian communities throughout the world are already doing a lot more than in the last 10 years than they did probably before, in the 80 years before. In the last 10 years, we're already seeing new young Assyrian scholars. We're seeing good publications on these issues. One reason that I got involved with this was precisely because of such young Assyrian scholars doing work, talking with me, not saying, Ara, you're Armenian, you deny the Assyrian genocide and picking fights. You don't want to pick fights. Don't create problems where there are no problems. The idea is to win people over. And Assyrians can win Armenians over. And I think this will happen very quickly once we take some very basic steps. And it's not about winning Armenians over. Armenians are minor players. You want to win the Anglo-Saxon world over. You want to win the French world over. You want to win the academic world over, because there is a real case to be made. And frankly, you will win the Turkish world over. There are Turks today who are interested in these issues. If you put books in front of them, they will read. Most of my work today as an Armenian scholar is done in Turkey, not in a diaspora anymore. So Turkey is not, in the last 10 years, has changed. There are lots more opportunities in Turkey. And this is where, in some ways, the Assyrian model might differ from the Armenian model. And I am on the Assyrian side. That is that Assyrians are already going back to Turkey. Assyrians are already claiming back territory in Turkey. At the beginning of this month, I was in Mardin. We went to Turabdin. It's very moving to see an old monastery that has been claimed back with pride, run by, not by as a museum, but run as a monastery by Assyrians. And I think that is the way to go forward. It's the genocide recognition, and this is something that our Assyrian communities need to discuss. It's not about, I think it's not about revenge. It's about getting at least some of the pieces back. It's about claiming your cultural patrimony. It's about making those links that were broken by 1915 and cultivating that Assyrian presence that you've been denied, and I've been denied because Assyrians are part of my world too, because of a genocide and a Seyfo. So there are all these possibilities. So what can we do? One is you need proper scholarship. If you have proper scholarship and good people who write, they will have untold influence. I read David Gaunt's book. I met him again in Mardin at the beginning of this month. He's not Assyrian, but he's a very good man. He does very good work. He's done a very good work. He writes in English. He writes for the mainstream English. One David Gaunt has already won over many people. And there are lots of bright Assyrians as well. So scholarship matters. I work with Sabri Atman, who's now doing his PhD in Boston. Sabri is a person who was my contact person. I think the Seyfo Center is supporting him. So it's a very, very good involvement. And he's already won me over. You need people like that who are not only knowledgeable, but who also have the character, the personality to engage others, to win them over. There's a diplomatic aspect to it. So that's already happening. There are new Assyrian scholars based in Australia and coming out, even out of Turkey. In Mardin, at this conference, there were young Assyrian scholars who know Turkish. There were young Turkish scholars who are interested in Assyrian in a genuine way. So these are all positive factors that are already in the way. It's a question of utilizing. The second one is that, from my perspective, is sources. One of the problems that we have is that Suryani, Assyrian, and sources are generally in Arabic and Syriac. So there is a distinct lack of sources for people who are interested. When I started getting involved on the Armenian genocide issue through the Gomidas Institute, one of the first things that we did was we translated about 6 to 10 primary sources on the Armenian genocide. That is diaries of people in Harput. In fact, I got some here. The letters they wrote and the American reports. We published these in English, some straight from the archive. They were already in English, some were in translation, so that if people show interest, Americans show interest, sophisticated graduate students in the MA programs, well, what do you give them in their hands? So you need some sort of core references, source material, to show them that, look, when we talk about the Assyrian genocide, this is the level of documentation that we have. If that information is not available to them, even if they show interest, they'll look in that direction. Okay, what else? There's nothing to read. They'll change their direction. But if you feed that interest initially, they may even learn Assyrian to work on the sources. The way I learned Turkish and Ottoman, they'll learn Assyrian or even Arabic to read these sources. And there are some key works on the Assyrian genocide that are still have not been translated, that are worth translating. So we're talking about 4 or 5 books at least that could be core work, so that you can start cultivating a new generation of scholars on this issue. And the Assyrians have already started. They have certain specific centers, like in Sweden, where they're also collecting oral histories or family papers. People have memoirs that have been handwritten that are in the family that no one's had read before, or even old letters and photographs. But the idea is to collect these materials in one place so that scholars can go and study them. All you need to do is win over half a dozen very good scholars in the world today, very good scholars in the world. The Assyrian issue then can become mainstream, because the argument is there to be made, right? It's very possible to do this type of work, one step at a time, but you will see the results within a matter of even a few years. When we started publishing our works 1 book at a time, after 2 years, I started seeing our primary sources that we published in the works of other scholars, non-Armenian scholars, in their footnotes. So you can actually see that if you make this material available, if these books end up in university libraries, people will read them. But if we didn't do that work, then those people would not have been able to take it one step further. It's about division of labor, and it's about taking some of that burden on our shoulders and setting the agenda. One of the greatest achievements of Gomidas Institute has been setting that agenda by the work that we do, and we still do that type of work. We're also doing a lot of translations from Armenian to English, memoirs, as well as other types of work, because we are feeding an interest that's growing. And this is an essential part. It's very modest work, but it's very important. So these changes are already happening even in the Assyrian world. It's a question of appreciating why they're important, being able to calculate their importance, and being able to do those small steps so that you will see the results in years to come. When I was doing when I done this map, I actually wanted to do an Assyrian map as well. I wanted there to be a population record at the bottom. Can I show you the next one? This is a map of the Ottoman Empire. Every single one of those crosses, these are all individual crosses, is a church. We can name every single cross on that map. And can the next one? And the other one is schools. I want to do something similar on the Assyrian one. And you know what? I couldn't. So number of schools, distribution of schools. So that shows you, but the information is available in a raw format, in archives. So this could be a project for one student, an MA student, even an advanced undergraduate student, to do this type of work. Once you do the work and you share it with people, visually, that tells you a lot. Can we go back to the population? Visually, that tells you a lot. So I looked at, well, how can we do an Assyrian map of this nature? Well, I found Agha Bedros's report from 1919, and I found a few others, but they hadn't been critically analyzed. But what I realized was that although the information hasn't been formed yet, the raw material for this type of work is available. If the raw material wasn't available, then we'll be in trouble. But it is available. It's sitting in archives, in British archives or American archives or private hands. But this type of work is just doing that pedantic work one step at a time. And once you do it, once you put it out there, once it's visually there, you're already making a statement. I wish we had and I want to do this one day, I want to have the yellow circle showing the distribution of Assyrians all the way into Iran, saying, when I show this map, say, the red dots is what the Armenians who were killed, that's the scale of people killed, we should also have the Assyrians there. If you want to win Armenians over, and this is what I want to do, and I think we will do that very soon, this is a sort of visual representation that with one picture tells you the whole story. That should be the starting point. But that initial work hasn't still been done. That it's being done in a piecemeal manner. My advice to you, and I'd like to work with you, is to accelerate that process, is to calculate that process, and to make that progress that needs to be done. And I think it's relatively straightforward. It's not rocket science. It's about doing the work. And there are people who can do the work, and the material is available. The challenge is to make it possible for that to take place. And that's the main reason that I want to talk to you. I think it's important that we discuss the Assyrian issue in this context, in a practical context, not because we want to cry about what happened in the past or how people don't listen to us. Quite the opposite. You know, we have the power, it's in our hands, and we can make progress. It's entirely up to us whether we make that progress. It's entirely up to us. But the possibilities are there, and by no means is it impossible. It's very much in our hands. And that's the message that I wanted to give to you today. And that's a discussion that I'd like to have with you about the practicalities, about organization, different communities, how you can cooperate together. I cooperate with Assyrians in Sweden. I've never met them before. I cooperate with Assyrians in Turkey. I just met some of them, and some in this country. And these are the people I just know in Australia. And I'm sure I only know a handful of them. So it's about networking, about doing the work. And this is part of that process. And next time, you know, we're publishing a book on the Armenian genocide and Assyrian genocide, the Seyfo, on Diyarbakir. And we're specifically publishing that because when you look at Diyarbakir, you can't talk of Armenians anymore because there are so many Assyrians and Chaldeans there. And to do a book launch where we invite Armenians and Assyrians together, where it's in an area where there was a very large number of both communities, and to start both thinking of the other, especially the Armenians, about Assyrians. In this case, it's the only case I can think of is Armenians can actually be the arrogant ones. Usually we are the victims of other people looking down on us, but here the Armenians are guilty of the same type of, I would say it's ignorance, and because it's ignorance, it's up to us to change that. Like I said, it's in our hands. I'd like to work with you guys on that and to come with a practical project. I think the Seyfo Center is probably the best way to go forward, and to have sort of practical projects that we can focus on. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. It was heavier than that, but you have to take it to England. I didn't want to be so heavy, so this is a monument was given to us to present it to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming over. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm flattered. I think it's beautiful. It's Assyrian. We'll put this in my office, and it's much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is the word.
The Kurdish role, yes, Armenians often, and including myself, I guess, in the past, talk of the Turkish state, or we will say the certain Kurdish tribes were co-opted by the state to carry out the genocidal process. Often the same analogies even today. I mean, there are Kurdish tribes today that fight against other Kurdish tribes, one on the state side, one's on the PKK in this case. So the Kurds are a tribal people. And from an Armenian perspective, there hasn't been a serious analysis of how do you assess that? I mean, if they're not a nation and they're individual tribes, do you talk about these specific tribes and it's not a Kurdish issue anymore? When we talk about Assyrian genocide, of course, it's in some ways much more straightforward. There's so many Kurds, it's their neighbors killing the Assyrian neighbors. There's so many of them involved that it's very difficult almost to say there were some Kurdish tribes who were not involved. And with the rise of Kurdish nationalism today, you're right, Kurds as a rule do not talk about their role in the killings, especially in the Assyrians, where it was so prevalent and so barbaric. When I was in Mardin, for example, the question of the Armenian genocide came up and the Assyrian genocide came up. Often Kurds themselves, or Kurdish nationalists, will use this as a way of criticizing the Turkish state, but they go quiet about, well, what about the Rama tribe, for example, that was involved in wiping out Armenians from Diyarbakir and Assyrians from Diyarbakir. So they go quiet. The question is, how do we raise this issue with Kurdish circle without necessarily trying to undermine their legitimate criticism as well? If I was a Kurd, if I was a Kurdish nationalist, I would be the first person to say, you know, we did wrong, we participated as a nation or as a tribe in the destruction of Christians, and we became victims of that type of destruction ourselves. Certainly Kurds have been victims in the last 80 years, which is why I have certain sympathy for them, irrespective of what has in the past. The Kurds were subjected to both murders as well as political assassination as well as forced assimilation. Perhaps that's why they're more critical. But I agree with you, we need some sort of statement from individual Kurds and Kurdish bodies that recognizes the past and rejects it, especially in the case of Assyrians who are working to go back. You know, what's interesting is that they have a monastery in Turabin, and already they are having problem with the specific Kurdish tribes of the area, of the land. It's just like in the old days. So we need the Kurdish society to open these issues more openly and to reject the past and their role in their negative role in the destruction of Armenians and Kurds and Assyrians. That could also be on our agenda, is educating Kurds. One of the things that we're trying to do as an organization, Gomidas Institute, is to open an office in Istanbul and one in Diyarbakir, because we need to engage Turkish audiences. I think a lot of Kurds we can win over, but it's a way of how do you talk to them, how do you start criticizing them without necessarily appearing that you mean them harm. It's to make it possible for them to confess, in Christian terminology. But they need to do that so that we feel secure. Regarding the land question, you said these were previously Assyrian Armenians. You're right, but they were also Kurdish lands. I'm not an Armenian nationalist in that way. I don't separate. Kurds are also part of that world. You might say, oh, they've only been here there for 300 years. Well, the United States is, white man's been here for that long too. The Kurds are part of our social landscape. We have to find a way in any kind of settlement, even within Turkey, of dealing with Turks and Kurds as separate bodies if need be. With the Kurds rising today, we need to find a way of engaging these issues without hiding the past, without lying about the past. And that is part of our challenge. That's a harder challenge. Maybe we should put our house in order here, to have firm roots, to have the scholarship, to have the knowledge in our hands, and then be able to engage the Kurds, engage Turkish intellectuals, even Turkish civil society on these issues. The Turkish government is something different. The Turkish military is something different. When you go inside Turkey, when you start working there, as I've been doing for this, I've been there since the 1990s, but the last 10 years, you see so many different opportunities. There are Turkish human rights organizations that support me every time I go there. They give me a platform to talk. There are certain Kurds working in those organizations. There are individual Turks and Kurds who initially are wary because I'm an Armenian, and over time you win them over. Sometimes they're afraid of us. They think that we want to go there to dispossess them of their land. This is what the government tells to the Turkish population, Turks and Kurds. They say the Armenians will come back or the Assyrians will come back. They're going to take your land away from you. And if you are a peasant, that is unthinkable. You support the government then, because you can't lose this land. This is their livelihood. Often those Turks, not the Kurds, but certainly in the Turkish case, they are themselves refugees from the Balkans. So in some ways, they're also victims as well. So it's a very complicated way. I personally say, if it's a land question, to me, it's not a territorial issue or a land question. You might be different. You have every right to be different. If you want to go your ancestral land because you want to live there, you have every right. But from my perspective, it's an easy concession to make. We're not peasants anymore. We're not the same people anymore. You know, we brought up in Western Europe, and the United States. So in some ways, that makes it simpler. If Armenians ever go back to Eastern Turkey, who's going to feed them? The local Turks and Kurds are, because they're not going to go there growing wheat and food, right? So it's a complicated issue, but the Kurdish factor needs to be addressed. maybe the first thing we should do is get knowledge ourselves. So we know our own history backwards, we know what tribes we're talking about, the level of Kurdish involvement, and then be able to cultivate links with the right people in Kurdish civil society to raise these issues in a sensitive manner where it's possible for them to come forward and say, yes, you're right, we did terrible things. Irrespective of what happened afterwards, we did terrible things. There are some Kurds who say that, who publish on these, but we need more. I think it was a year ago, 2 years ago, a Kurdish man gave his property back. It's very symbolic, it's very important. If a Turk offered my grandmother's land back to me, I would say, I appreciate sentiment and I'd like you to keep it, right? I think that would be a nice gesture too. We don't mean you harm in resolving these problems. We can resolve these issues without harming people. And that might, in some ways, I think is the right balance and right attitude. It's not about revenge. The ultimate benefit, a dream, a moral closure and a sense of dignity or indignity that we have to live with as an Armenian, knowing what has been done to my ancestors, what has been taken away from us, to come some sort of restitution, to allow Armenians or Assyrians who want to live there again to live there, to have some sort of control over a cultural patrimony that has been destroyed but some is still there. That means to get back our churches and lands, to make sure they're preserved, and to allow the cultivation of Armenians and Assyrians who are still living there, often as crypto-Christians, to come out in the open and to recultivate the presence of our people there. It'll never be like before, but to create that cultural, that strand of history, to find the strands and for continuity. Our roots are there. Every day I'm aware that in a sense, I don't belong where I live. Right? Whether it's the food that I eat or my choice, my aesthetic choices, it comes from that land. I feel a link to the land itself. I have a 5-year-old boy. I say at a personal level, for me the issue will be, if not resolved, certainly be a big change, is when I can take my son with me to go and play in the streets of Diyarbakir with Kurdish children. If we can do that, and we're accepted as Armenians, to me at a very personal level is a solution. But I can't do that. My wife would not let me take my son there, and I don't argue with her. So, I mean, this is why I say it's not difficult. The problem is on the other side, it's on the Turkish side. They are the problem, ideologic, and they still hate Armenians, and they still hate Assyrians. They're brought up that way. And we need to break those barriers as part of the process. There is a greater sense of what's called Islamophobia in this country than there is outside of this country. In Europe, you don't hear this. In Turkey, many of the people recognizing the Armenian genocide are actually Muslims, practicing Muslims. They will say Islam does not condone mass murder. They say it's nationalism that destroyed these minorities. Kemalism is a nationalist ideology. Kemalism also persecuted Muslims. So one can actually turn this around. You could say true Muslims should reject the legacy of genocide, and it's possible for them to do so because Islam has only risen in the last 10 years in Turkey. They were also victims of the Kemalists. And the Kemalists is a continuation of the Young Turks. I don't think that is necessarily a problem. It's when Turkish nationalists adopt Islam as well, then you have a problem. But I don't think Islam is necessarily a problem. Iran is an Islamic republic. You're a better judge than I am whether it matters or not. But my sense is that I don't see that as a problem. Okay, so it's not negative. This year on April 24th, I was in Istanbul at Taksim Square. There was one of the demonstration for the Armenians. The main speaker was a woman wearing the hijab who denounced what happened to Armenians as being anti-Islamic, that it was a sin, and she said, we should, and she was a journalist as well, well known, and she said, we as Muslims need to recognize this and reject it. That was something positive. The question is when these things happen, if you let it, that was an incident, you let it fly is one thing, but we should be aware of these debates in Turkey and actually empower Muslims as well. We should also say that. It's not Islam necessarily that kills. Islam is often used if you want to attack Christians. Did you know there are many, I remember when I read the massacre of Karabash, right? Mainly Assyrian outside Diyarbakir. there's a primary record by an American doctor, Smith, Floyd O. Smith from Diyarbakir. He said the local imam, February 1915, himself opposed this. This is happening in a small village, so it's a nationalist state that's trying to murder these people. He said that the local imams condemned as saying, we have no right to murder people. So, like I said, let's not make problems that aren't necessarily there. So we should be more open-minded. And certainly when you go in Turkey, I don't see a problem, Islam. I fear more Turkish nationalists and secularists whose worldview is such that there is no place for minorities. It's about ethnic cleansing. At least in Islam, there's some place for Christians, even if it's not necessarily on equal terms. But there is some place. It's a nationalist Turks who are the problem. I don't see a compromise there. They're fascists. This is the problem, Turkish nationalists. I personally would not accept blood money. I think you're letting them off free. If they said, how much is your grandfather worth to you? $50,000? Would you accept that? And is that the end of the matter? You're almost you're saying now we're quits. You know, I personally wouldn't accept anything. It's in a sense, Turkey owes us something that they can never repay. But if they want to start, I would say by reversing the legacy of 1915 by at least trying to save the remnants of people who are still there, the culture, and allowing any Armenian or Syrian to return, and to return not as immigrants, but to return as a right of return, and to be not to be tolerated by the state, but to be protected by the state in an active way, educationally, politically, whatever. So this is my personal perspective. There are some people who say, no, I want land, I want this, I want that. It's a tough one. We all have a right to have our own expectations, but I don't. You see, what mine is: change the Turkish constitution. It's not about revenge. My perspective. I believe in humanity. I think that this is sort of my cliche thing to say. I say that when I go to Turkey, there 20% of them are on our side, 20% are against us, and like fascistically, we will never win them over. The battle is about 60% of people. They are decent people. They are under the government's authority and control. They believe the government. But if you talk to them on one-to-one basis, you can win them over. And the idea is to win them over. You know, it's entirely up to us. And that's where the solution lies. And today it's possible to work in Turkey. The Turkish state is still trying to indoctrinate them, but in modern day, you can't, especially with modern communications and the internet. And the youngsters, you can win them over. When I work in Turkish archives, all the youngsters talk about the Armenian genocide. Then you don't find deniers. I mean, if I was a denier of Turkey, I'd be worried, because intelligent scholars that are coming, even in Turkey, don't support the official Turkish thesis. It's changing there too. And if we get involved, if we empower these people, and we give them a better voice, and we give them resources, they'll act more on our parts. So Turkey is changing itself. There are new opportunities there. So as long as we're prepared morally, intellectually, and we have the character to go there, there's a lot more we can do. Otherwise, you can wait 100 years. But why 100 years? You can do 10 years. You can see major change, even sooner. There are major Turkish scholars today who would deny the Armenian genocide 10 years ago, who today recognize it. I was mentioned to Hassan Cemal, the grandson of Cemal Pasha, supposedly one of the organizers of genocide, which I don't think is true. But he is a very well-known journalist in Turkey. He just published a book called Armenian Genocide, Ermeni Soykırımı, 1915. Big letters. You can see in bookshops in Turkey. It's unheard of, but it's happening. So if we give more voice, you amplify that voice, you give more prominence, you bring Hassan Cemal here. Why not? He speaks English. You give him the prominence that he deserves. You show him the respect. You're encouraging others to do the same, to be brave, to speak out. So these are positive options that we have engaging these issues. And we should be aware of them. And then they don't really require great resources. Hassan Cemal did come here a few years ago. He spoke to Armenians, I think it's Glendale. But others can do as well. We can set the agenda. Or we can have conferences in Turkey. We just had a conference in Mardin at the beginning of this month, where most of the papers were about Assyrians and Armenians, including the genocide. It was organized by the Hrant Dink Foundation. In Mardin, it was unheard of. Now, I'll be very, but then and some local organizations supported the local bar association and whatnot. But let's be realistic. The university did not support it. The university did not allow that to take place on its premises. Okay, so now you know who's on your side, who's not on your side, and you work accordingly. But you find there is space now in Turkey to work. There was a conference in Diyarbakir. Well, next year maybe they do Turabin. Why not? Do it in the monastery. Maybe the theme could be Christians and the destruction of Christians in 1915. Why not? And let the locals participate. Apparently the Diyarbakir conference last year was exceptionally good. The mayor took part of it. 3 days, he engaged all the papers. The mayor of Diyarbakir. All right? So these are positive developments that are opportunities for us to engage in order to have a voice, in order to be heard and to have influence. And there are some Assyrians who are even willing to go back there and live there. I envy the Assyrians. I envy you because the possibility of going there is still there, and there are still Assyrians who are willing to go there and to recultivate the Assyrian presence in those lost lands. I think it's amazing, and those people should be recognized for what they are, and including the churches. The Armenian church hasn't done that. The Armenian church no Armenian church said, let's go and restart the Varaka monastery, for example, outside of Van. It's an offer. It's possible. The Armenian church could go and renovate the whole place, and they could even have precept. They don't. It's a completely different mentality. I'm actually disappointed in that. I marvel at the Assyrian church for actually staking a claim and saying that we want to go back there because it is who we are. You haven't abandoned your ship. Now, see, I admire Assyrians, and I think that this is something that we should point out and to shame the Armenians, saying you should be doing this. There are about, if you look at accounts of the Assyrian genocide, Seyfo, there are about half a dozen key sources that are cited in Arabic and in Syria that we know of. I couldn't tell the titles offhand, but I can tell you later. Then there are oral testimonies that have been collected by Assyrian scholars. They could be transcribed or translated. But it's not even as difficult as that. There are English language sources that haven't been tapped. For example, I mentioned that in northwestern Iran there were Americans there. There were American missionaries and there were American consuls. Those records haven't been completely mined yet. You can actually go to the Presbyterian archives, which are now microfilm, and you can, if I was an Assyrian, if I was, let's say, a MA student or even a history major writing a thesis, you could go to Philadelphia and you could sit there and you could collect all the Assyrian-related materials, put them side by side, and that becomes a major source, primary source. But right now they're interspaced with all the other stuff there and correspondence with the missionaries. So unless you're a scholar and you're willing to go and to read them once and to write in your book, that'll be the end of it. But if you go and collect it all together and you put it on the internet or you publish it as a book, that will allow 100 scholars to read it without necessarily going to Philadelphia. You're making it possible. It's a division of labor. You do that to the initial work, you're allowing 100 people to cite it. This is where we started. Some of the works that we've got there is, it's a cow. I can find this cow and I can milk it to write my own, my article, my book, and feel how clever. Or I can get that cow and I can make it available to everybody else. I'm saying from a community perspective, make it available to everybody else so they can all use it and you raise the level of scholarship. Right? So those are the American archives. And I suspect there are those same missionaries had diaries or wrote correspondence that are in different archives or within their families. You can put these materials together. And that becomes a key reference point, especially for people who have initial interest, but they don't know which way to look. And if they start working on this stuff and they start taking that direction, then they have every incentive to continue, even to learn Assyrian, so that they can go to the other sources that otherwise wouldn't be available to them. But there are these core works, including the English language. And we're not talking German. The Germans are interesting. You keep seeing the Germans had a consulate in Mosul. The Germans reporting what was going on upstream in the Diyarbakir area. The guy called name was Holstein, and there's a German consul in Aleppo. Armenians have collected a lot of this stuff for their own website. There's a website for German records on the Armenian genocide, but you could do specific for the Assyrians. So it's a question of just doing the work. And then once you put at least a critical body of work, you've made your case. You don't have to show the same thing 100 times. You just show it enough times to win people over. That's the point I was making. And there is enough work to be done. If you're interested, of course, I'd be happy to work with you, or talk to some of the Assyrian scholars. They also know. Sabri Atman knows, right? And we're not just talking about the Assyrian, the 1915. If you look at before 1915, which tells you where they lived, the numbers, the conditions, and so on, then there is it's endless material. In London alone, the Public Records Office, now called National Archive, they were interested in Assyrians for at least 100 years. The Anglican Church was involved with the Assyrians for decades. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of pages that shed light on the Assyrians in the Hakkari area and the Diyarbakir area before 1915. So that material is just, again, it's amazing, and it's very easy to work with. The British Archives are a very good place to work. You can go, I have a friend of mine, he goes there with a camera, there are no restrictions. You can photograph 2,000 documents in a day, 2,000 to 3,000 documents. That's what he does. It's like he takes the archives away. So you go there, you collect 10,000 pages, then you make it available to other Assyrians to work on. I mean, this sharing that information is a key at this point, and to multiply the scholarship that's based on it. But the material does exist, so it's not like we're in an impossible situation. Quite the opposite. The opportunities are there. The question is whether we're organized enough to do that, to do something with it. Probably the last 2 generations, Assyrians were remnants of genocided people. They were poor, and they were trying to make ends meet. Now we're reaching a generation that's more established, that's better educated, that has the means to actually get involved with these things. And so now might be the right time to start working on these materials. How do you know there's no evidence unless you've looked? But they're wrong. But they're wrong. That's the whole point. Look at David Gaunt's work, who's not even Assyrian or whatever. He's already amassed so much material. His work is amazing. Is amazing. But this is why I said okay. Let's get a body of evidence. Maybe you can work through the Seyfo Center. They can say, okay, let's publish five of these books in English and make it available to all scholars. That becomes a key reference point for anyone who's interested, and you can shove it on people's noses. Well, this is the evidence. But people who've told you that is because they're ignorant, and they're actually wrong. And you shouldn't take that knock that they give you and walk away just because, oh, well, maybe they must be. They're not right. They're wrong. But it's up to you to argue your case. It's about Assyrians, first and foremost, Assyrians to empower themselves and to argue their case. Because don't rely on other people to do it for you. It won't. But you have to do it yourself, and you can. That's the point. And you're there in a piecemeal manner. There's Sabri Atman, there's someone doing something else. You have a Seyfo Center here, a Seyfo Center there. You put these resources in an individual, there's already a critical body of organizations and people. It's a question of now rationalizing it and seeing what are the weaknesses, what do you need now to make progress, and making the progress. But you're almost there. It's up to you how you go forward. The Armenians' first ignorance was one reason I gave. Second one is lack of existing scholarship on Assyrians. That's why they're ignorant, because they couldn't know more. The Armenians is a state today, so I don't know whether there are political reasons why they do not recognize the Assyrian genocide. It's not an excuse, and I don't accept it. And this is why Assyrians should put pressure on them. But why doesn't the Armenian Genocide Museum recognize the Assyrian genocide? Why don't Armenian Diasporan Organization recognize it? But before we ask that question now, is what I suggest, it might be the more politically astute way of going ahead, is let's do some of the scholarly work, let's put some of those works out there so that they can't deny, they can't say there's a lack of evidence or anything along those lines. Let's win them over because we can. You probably can win them over even now, by the way. There's enough material to work on them. But we need to create this type of opportunities where there are mixed Armenian audiences, that we can report some of the findings of this type of meeting. I think most Armenians, I would say a third of Armenians will be immediately receptive to Assyrian issue once they hear this type of debate. A third. And the next third will be, you can win over by showing them the materials that we're talking about. And the other third, I don't know. They're bigots, or they don't care about anything. But again, you can win Armenians over. It's a question of doing the work. You are strong enough today to make a difference. You are strong enough as a community to make a difference. It's in your hands. The Americans will try and use the Syrian issue vis-a-vis Iraq or this and the other, or you might say the Israelis or the Iranians. At the end of the day, you are not stupid. You're not. You're actors. It's a question of you having the strength and the intelligence and the organization is to speak up for yourself and to make your own case. But you have to do that. I mean, really, it's in your hands. I mean, and it's not a difficult case. It's a question of, don't make an excuse. You can do this. Like you just asked me the right question. Where do we start? What's the right place to start? To make a better case so that people can't deny, to start winning more people on our side, so that next year we're in a stronger position, and then take it forward from that. I mean, that's...
About 10 years ago, they approved us because we marched with them on our report.
Who's them? You did Armenians. Just say it. Just say it. Okay, say it.
That means it was approved.
If
They changed their mind.
then the answer, can I say, I don't know why that is. There could be prejudice, all kinds of reasons. But I can also tell you that most Armenians are ignorant on this issue, which is why, even if they're being manipulated by political parties, you can talk to them. Because they're not stupid either. But it's up to you to whether you can talk to them properly and present them the relevant facts to win them over. And I'm here to say I'm on your side. I like to work on, as an Armenian organization, representative of an Armenian organization. I think it's possible to win them over. So don't try and create obstacles. Please don't try that aren't there. I'd rather ignore that. Let's work on individuals and groups, but you can win them over. If they knew what were the facts and then they said, no, we don't like Assyrians for this and reason, then you'd be in a hard part. But they really do not know what their issues are. If you say that Assyrians were literally slaughtered in villages, hundreds of villages in Upper Mesopotamia, hundreds and hundreds of villages, right? And you give affidavits of some of these killings, how in Mardin they were marched down the hill in chains and they were beheaded in the plain in full view of everybody, and you can show corroborated evidence from 3 or 4 different sources, that is compelling. But you have to make that argument. And it's not available. I mean, these kids in Glendale and so on, they don't see this stuff. If they're skeptical, they're wrong, but it's up to you to win them over. It's up to me as well. I accept that. We, as an organization, Gomidas Institute, we want to translate some of these works into Armenian. We want to publish in Armenian and release them in Armenian. And I'm doing this as a good Armenian. I'm ashamed in some ways that the Armenians are not more supportive of Assyrians. And this is a work that we want to get involved in. But you have to do your work as well. Yes, I will only talk about the Assyrian issue on Tuesday. And I told you, I'm here because you brought me over. I didn't do any Armenian events. I said if Armenians want, let them pay. The Assyrians have the dignity and the intelligence and whatever, the foresight to bring me here to talk about this issue because they want to empower themselves on these issues. They can't sort of get something off of your backs. Let them see that Assyrians can be proactive. Yes, I will discuss this. And the presenter is also very sympathetic, which is good. So that's a start. How does Gomidas Institute? Gomidas Institute started as a joke. In 1990 or 91, I was a student at the University of Michigan, and this old man came up to us. He had a manuscript. He said, I want to publish this, but no one wants to publish it. I said, okay, let's do it. We'll do it. A bunch of students, we did it. We published it. We had a core name. We just made it up a name, Gomidas Institute. And that was the end of it. And then somebody else came up to us. And we realized that there are people with manuscripts that would never be published, and that we would lose out because these manuscripts are documents, right? So we started doing more and more books. Genocide documentation was a key issue in the 1980s. The Turkish state was saying there is no evidence on the Armenian genocide. Americans were repeating this. We said, all right, exactly what I'm telling you now. I said, okay, we are going to publish a critical set of these books, some of which are here, just to show that the type of information there is, and enough of it that's compelling. So we did that. We did book by book, project by project. We raised funding for it from individuals, plus the sale. So that covered the expense. And we maintained this type of publication program with the support of individual Armenians. Often somebody will give a donation out of $3,000 for the books we publish with a dedication in their family's name, which is a nice thing to do, victim of the genocide. And they know that this book is going to serve a real purpose. So that's how we started. If you look at our books, most of them have dedications at the beginning. That's how we started. So that was one. And after a while, we started doing projects for which I would write grants, and I would explain why we need to do this project, what is the purpose, where it's going to get us. And I applied to individuals or organizations. And because every time we delivered, people would support us again. Some of our biggest donors have given us money several times. Just to give an example, I showed the American documents. In the 1990s, the American government, as you know, the American government doesn't recognize the Armenian genocide, including the State Department. So we published that book called State Department Records on the Armenian Genocide, right? And as part of the deal, the donor gave us was very generous. We gave one copy to every American senator. Right? This was part of the deal. So with politics and lobbying, legitimate lobbying, was one married to the other. And the donor was very happy because they saw the benefits of doing this. If there is a strong Armenian voice in Congress, one of them is because you're cultivating them. You're giving this information at the fingertips, because they're not going to go in the archives and look for these bits and pieces. No senator or their aides will do that. But if you present it under the nose and there it is, and it's done with integrity, if they doubt, they can check, they can do spot check, it's completely clear, then they'll be supporting. The Turkish state has said the Blue Book in 1915 was a fabrication. Fabrication. So what did? We published the critical edition of the Blue Book, showing exactly how it was put together, right? That riled them. And then we, with the help of California Armenians, we translated into Turkish, and we released the book in Ankara. Turks today read that book, and it's a live issue today, because the Turkish parliament is on record saying this is a fabrication. The British fabricated the Armenian genocide thesis in 1915. They made it all up as part of wartime propaganda. This includes Assyrians. It's such a ridiculous thing to say, and it's because it's a Turkish parliament saying this, with a signature of over 500 Turkish members of parliament. We said this is a battle we want to get into, because it's not only about the Blue Book, it's about the integrity of the Turkish parliament now. How far would they lie? So when we released this in Turkey, they stopped. We sent copies to the Turkish parliamentarians. It was printed in Turkey. They stopped the distribution of the book. The parliament itself stopped it. They boycotted the actual release in Ankara. They were all invited. But the Turkish press was there. The foreign embassies were there. And it's not over, because the Turkish silence on this issue means that the silence is the response. In fact, we're going to have an event, Ragip Zarakolu, we work with the human rights activists, want to do another event December on the Blue Book issue. We're just going to go back again. And every time we go back again, we're showing the Turkish public, your own parliament is lying about this issue. Your own parliament cannot even defend itself. The Turkish intellectuals cannot argue their own case. The reality is that there's a big bluff there. And the same is on the Assyrian issue. They're relying on you not to go there and not to challenge them. They're relying on you to allow the Turkish state to have a monopoly of indoctrinating the Turkish population. Right? They don't want you. But what I'm saying is that there are possibilities of now talking to Turkish public at large by printing these books and having them distributed. Having said that, many people don't want to distribute our books. So we do it through the internet, or we put it online. And Turkish human rights activists and scholars say what you're doing is actually very useful, and we're using it all the time. So it's one step at a time, but it has an impact. If you do something on the Assyrian issue and you distribute it, especially amongst Kurds, you have a readership. There are many Kurds today who are interested in these issues, but they're still on the sway of the government, and also the old Kurdish families that were involved in the genocidal process itself. The Pirincizade family, for example, in Diyarbakir, who got incredibly rich because of the genocide, are still there. Of course, they're going to work against you, but the local population is very different. But as long as we don't have a voice there, they have a monopoly. They can say whatever they want. It's up to us to go and challenge them. And before we do that, let's make sure that we know the score, we know what the issues are, so that when we go there, we can make a good case, a compelling case.